Guys, it's Joe, a Pro Flight Trainer, and today we are in X-Plane 11 checking out the AB412 by X-Trident. And we're going to be, we're back at Henderson Airfield, Henderson Executive Airfield near Las Vegas, with the same conditions that were set in the last video I did with the BCS UH-1. If you haven't seen that, go to the YouTube channel, check it out. If you got some time, they're kind of long videos. Hopefully this one won't be as long, but it probably will be. So today's conditions, we're back at Henderson with a field elevation of roughly 2,000 feet. The model as we have it set up here weighs about 9,000 pounds, so it's a little heavier than the UH-1. Actually, it's a lot heavier than the UH-1. And temperature outside is 20 degrees Celsius, and winds are calm. So we're going to get right into it. So we're going to start with a hover power check, just like we did with the UH-1. Now, a couple of differences between this test and the last test. I didn't have access to as much documentation as far as performance goes. I got a hold of a Bell 412 manual. I'm not sure if it's the same version of the 412 that's modeled here, but one thing I didn't have access to was a performance chart that would give me a predicted hover torque. There was plenty of performance charts in there, but none that would give me a predicted hover torque. So we're going to do a hover power check just to see what kind of power we're working with, and we'll be focusing on this gauge right there, torque gauge. We got looks like a mass moment gauge there as well. So we're going to pull up into an IGE hover, and we'll see what kind of power we're working with. Let's see. Here we go. So power's coming in, coming up off the ground, and we are looking at about 30% torque. Okay, and we are a little high on the hover, but that's all right. And we get this thing under control here. Kind of hard to hover when you have your face smashed into the instrument panel. Okay, so 30% torque is what we got. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could have a hover power prediction chart like we had with the UH-1, but I just don't have access to it. I'm not saying one doesn't exist, I just couldn't find one. Alright, so continuing on with the test, the remainder of the test is going to be done looking down here at the there we go, at the instrument panel. The remainder of the test is going to be done with AP1 and 2 disengaged. Okay, so that's basically the part of the automatic flight control system that the 412 has. So actually I'll turn it back on just to show you while we're doing this. Turn it back on. There we go. So AP1, AP2 back engaged. So if we pull up on the collective, you'll see without any pedal input, the nose stays put. Which I know some of you guys want to scream that's unrealistic, but in all reality, it very well may not be. There are quite a few helicopters that have this capability, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that the 412 would have this capability as well. So there's plenty of medium twin engine helicopters that can do this. But we are not particularly testing the automatic flight control system for this test. We're testing the helicopter's performance. So we're going to do the rest of the test with AP1 and 2 in the off position. And in the, if you're not familiar with this model, the 412, the X-Trident 412 comes with its very own plug-in that you can customize everything. And we're going to have the SAS in a, I guess, low state, so it's not going to be as effective. So I think there's three positions, three modes you can have it in. It's like low, medium, or low, normal, and high. So we're going to have it in a low state for this test, just so we can test the helicopter itself and how it's modeled, not necessarily the avionics and the automatic flight control system. Okay? Alright, so moving on to the next test. Actually, what we'll do is we're going to move out to the, going to reposition the helicopter here. Probably should have started in a better position, but we're going to get out into the open here so we can do our no pedal takeoff. And the reason I want to get out in the open is I don't want us to fly through any buildings or anything. Alright, so we're just going to come out here to the taxiway. Here we go. Alright, I'm going to set the aircraft on the ground and get the pedals nice and centered. There we go. Looks pretty good. Alright, fleet are going on the floor, and this is going to be, we're doing the no pedal takeoff. So if this is your first time checking out one of the accuracy flight test videos, what we're going to do is we're going to pick the aircraft off the ground with the pedals centered, and basically we're checking for the torque effect to see if any torque effect is modeled. So what we should see is the aircraft spinning to counter the rotation of the main rotors that are spinning above our heads there. Alright, so with the main rotor spinning one way, the fuselage should want to spin the other direction. And again, AP 1 and 2 are off, so we essentially have the automatic flight control system disengaged. Alright, so here we go. Power's coming in. We already know we're going to come off, we're going to hover at about 30% torque, so aircraft should get light around 20. Oh, a little bit, yep, here we go, 20%, and we're already starting a rotation to the right, so that's a good sign. And it's a pretty quick rotation to the right, too. Alright, bringing the aircraft off the ground, and there we go, we are spinning. Alright, so torque effect is definitely modeled, and as I lift up on the collective even more, it looks like our rate of turn, you can see on the HSI there, speeds up a little bit. Alright, so that is definitely realistic. You know, I'm trying desperately to keep the aircraft level here, and habitually wanting to put in pedal to stop it. So I'm going to lower the collective just a little bit, see if I can't fly out of this. I don't think I can. Alright, so I'm going to stop this, because I don't want to have to reset the whole thing. Alright, coming back over to the taxiway. So that was pretty good. So torque effect is definitely modeled, and we got a nice rapid rotation without any pedal input. So now what we'll do is we're going to look at the pedal input actually required to maintain a heading. And looking down at the pedals, you can see that we do have a pretty decent amount of left pedal in there to keep the nose straight. So that's actually pretty realistic. And again, hovering about 30% torque, we're going to keep that in mind for when we load the helicopter down later on to see if there's any changes. Alright, next thing we're going to do is we're just going to do some 360-degree pedal turns just to see if the pedal input required for a turn is realistic. Alright, and so we already established we got a pretty decent amount of pedal in for an IG hover. So we're just going to clear ourselves around to the left, bring the nose around to the left, and it takes just a little bit of extra pedal to start that turn, which is about right. Shouldn't take much more than than what we had for IG hover. I'm going to put a little bit more pedal in to start this turn. Not a whole lot. It's looking pretty good. Feels pretty good. And the amount of pedal pressure I have applied to me feels appropriate for the rate of turn that I've got. So now we're going to go to the other direction. So I'm just going to ease up off the left pedal a little bit, or add right pedal, however you want to call it, and make a hovering turn to the right. Nice and slow. Pretty good. This feels about right. And just easing up that pressure a little bit gets me a pretty decent rate of turn. Of course, I'm all over the place here because I'm running my mouth. Here we go. Yeah, we're looking pretty good. This is pretty decent. Yeah, I like that. Alright, now we're going to jam some pedal in there and just see how quick we can get the rotation to go. Alright, so here comes some more pedal. There you go. And that's more pedal equals a higher rate of rotation. That looks pretty good. Alright, we're just going to transition to forward flight here. Go back to the little test flight area I used last time. Of course, this being X-plane, the scenery's not going to look exactly the same as it did in DCS. We're kind of operating off the no frills as far as scenery-wise goes. I do have some ortho scenery up because it looks nice, but I pretty much have everything else turned down because between the Oculus Rift and recording, it's really a drag on the frame rate. So I've got all the rest of the scenery turned down a whole bunch, so we can get some decent frame rates for you guys. Don't want to make anybody motion sick. Okay. So Next thing we're going to do is we're just going to do some turns. Well, first we're going to check the trim and cruise flight. So looking down at my trim ball, I still have takeoff power in, and I've got a little bit less pedal than I had earlier, but you can see that we're just a little bit out of trim, which is about right. So I'm going to take out climb power, go into cruise power, and that's actually exactly what we want to see. So we see the trim ball going off to the right as I reduce the collective, and that's good. So I'm going to add some right pedal, a little bit more right pedal. There we go. Now we've got the trim ball centered, and we have just a little bit of right pedal, and that is what we're looking for. And that's something I was really missing in the UH1. So in cruise flight, the tail rotor should be offloaded. Vertical fin out there on the end of that tail boom should be taken over, and the slipstream going across the fuselage of the aircraft should be helping keep the aircraft straight. And the tail rotor is not completely offloaded, but it's a lot of the work it has to do is being taken over by that vertical fin back there. So as far as trim in normal cruise flight, that's exactly what we want to see. That's fairly realistic for an aircraft this size. We're going to enter a turn, left turn first, and see what happens. Once again, winds are calm, so we shouldn't have to establish any crab angle. You can see the trim ball starting to favor the left side of the gates there, which isn't all that unrealistic. Just a little bit of left pedal brings that trim ball right back to where it's supposed to be. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now we'll keep this going for a little bit, and we'll make another right turn here back towards the airfield. But right now, as from what I see now, I'm very happy with the trim ball response as far as pedal requirements. So that the pedal trim correlation is very realistic in this model, which that's actually quite pleasing. Okay, so making a turn to the right, we're going to see what happens. All right, and the trim ball is starting to favor the right side of the trim gates there. You can see that. So a little bit of right pedal will bring that guy right back into trim, looking pretty good. All right, well, that's pretty good. I'm going to call that realistic. So definitely give them max points for that. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring the aircraft back to the airfield, and we're going to load it up to not quite max gross, because if we load it to max, and look, if we load this thing to max gross weight, we may not have IGE power. So what we're going to do is we're going to load up as heavy as we can for the conditions, so we'll still have power, but still heavy enough to where we can determine that there's a difference in the pedals. So right now, so we took off at about 9,000 pounds, so we're probably down to about 880-ish right now. We're going to load it up to about, not quite 11,000 pounds, but probably somewhere in the 10,800 range here. And we'll do that once we get the aircraft on the ground. So what we're going to do, now that we're back at a hover, we can see the amount of pedal required to maintain a hover at our current gross weight. So you can see it down there. Alright, and I'm going to set the aircraft down. I'm going to leave the pedals where they are. So make note, they shouldn't change that position. And what we're going to do is we're going to load the aircraft up. And we are going to increase its weight. So yeah, we're about 880, 878. So we're going to load this up to about 10,800 pounds. We'll go for 11,000. That should be okay. We should be okay with 11,000 pounds. Okay, so we're going to apply that change. Here we are. So pedal position hasn't changed, only the weight has. So we've increased our payload, and there's a fuel truck for some reason, but we'll keep, no big deal. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start picking up to a hover, and we know we hovered at 9,000 pounds at 30% torque, so we should expect that's going to take a lot more than that. So here we go, and that's correct. So we're about 30% torque. Aircraft's getting light, so we definitely need more power, but we can also see that at our lighter pedal setting, we have insufficient amount of pedal to keep the aircraft from rotating. So the aircraft's response to weight changes is pretty realistic. So now to keep this nose from rotating to the right, I'm going to have to increase the left pedal. There we go. So we have even more left pedal in there. And that's pretty realistic. That's what we're looking for. And looking at our torque gauge, we are hovering at 35% torque. So it takes about 5% more torque to lift roughly just what, like 2,300 pounds more. So that's pretty good. That's pretty realistic. Okay, so now we are going to take the aircraft's weight. I'm going to take it back down. Take it back down to about 9,000 pounds. Give this a little bit more fuel here. Actually, we'll take it down to about 8,500. That should be plenty to do what we want to do. Okay. So now we got our weight back down to something that's going to take a little bit less effort on the aircraft's part. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to test the torque and RPM influence. So basically what we're going to do is we're just going to test the effects of the pedals on the torque and the RPM. So we're looking at the triple tack here and the torque gauge there. Alright, so what we should see is come up, and we're going to go back to my little test flight area here. So what we should see when we mash on the pedal, on the left pedal or power pedal, if you watched my videos before, you'll know that when some folks say power pedal, I say left pedal because I've been flying American-made helicopters. So the left pedal is the power pedal. So those two things are synonymous. So when I mash on the left pedal, we should see a temporary rise in torque. And when I mash on the right pedal, we should see a drop in torque because we're increasing and decreasing the load demands on the transmission respectively. Okay, so get into cruise flight here. Trying to get that VSI leveled out. There we go. And got a nice low power setting, so we're looking at about 20% torque. Alright, I'm going to mash some left pedal in there. Alright, we saw a little bit of a spike in torque, not much, just a little bit. Alright, it's back down to 20%, and I'm going to mash in some right pedal here. Okay, a little bit delayed, but we saw a little bit of a reduction in torque. Not much. For the amount of pedal I jammed in there, I would have expected to see more of a reaction there, more than just about 5%. But well, let's try it again as we head back towards the airfield. I'm going to slow down just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to slow down a lot of it. We're going to give it about 60 knots here. There we go, about 60 knots of Lewis. So now we're talking about 15%. There we go. Alright. And some left pedal. A little bit of a rise, not much. And some right pedal. Actually almost nothing. So that probably is, I would expect to see a little bit more reaction in torque. Now with a governed aircraft like this, I don't expect to see any real reaction in the RPM, especially one that's as well built as the 412. But we can try it. So right now we can see that our RPM is in the is in the middle of the green there, and the rotor RPM is the inner circle. I'm pointing into it like you guys can see me, but it's the inner circle. So when I mash in that right pedal, yeah, we don't see much fluctuation in the RPM, which is fine. I wouldn't really expect to see that much of a change there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check the RPM reaction in basically what we're checking for is conservation of angular momentum. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a series of maneuvers where we're going to try to get the rotor disc to cone, basically get all the blades to flap up at the same time. And when we do that, we should expect to see the RPM over here on the triple tack. You should see that rise. Okay, so there's a couple ways we're going to do that as we come up off the ground. So I'm going to build up some speed here as we fly down the taxiway. I'm going to do a rapid deceleration or a quick stop and see if we get any, and when we do that, we're going to really load the rotor disc, and we should see that rotor RPM climb as we do that. So when I do this, I'm going to lower the collective, bring the cyclic back, and actually I didn't see any real RPM movement there. That's kind of weird. Alright, so let's try it again just to be sure. Give myself a little bit more altitude to work with here, just to make sure I stay safe. Alright, so the collective's going to go down, cyclic's going to come back. Okay, there we go. Alright, I did see some a climb in the rotor RPM that time. That's what we were looking for. So let's try it one more time just to make sure that wasn't an anomaly. So coming back down the taxiway. We'll keep a little bit more altitude again. Just make sure the tail stays clear. Alright, and keeping an eye on that triple tack there, looking for the rotor RPM needle. There we go. Okay, actually we oversped it that time. Okay, so we know that works. We know it works in a quick stop or a rapid deceleration. So let's see if we can get it to climb during some steep turns. So we'll come out here just to the west of the field here, and we're building some airspeed. We're about 110 knots, and we're going to do a turn to the left here. There we go. A little bit more turn than I wanted, but that's alright. Not a lot of... We probably should have seen a little bit of RPM increase. Unless I'm not even sure. I may have accidentally habitually checked the RPM with the rotor, with the collective. We'll try to get to the right. I'm going to take my hand off the collective this time to make sure I don't accidentally correct it, or if I have it. So going around to the right. So we saw a little bit of a climb in all three needles on the triple tack. A little bit of F cyclic to see if we can't. Nope. Alright, nothing. Alright, and those maneuvers are a bit more aggressive than I think anybody would really do in a 412. But we did get some rotor coning and some RPM increase during the quick stop, rapid deceleration type maneuvers. Alright, the next test we're going to do is needle separation. So we're going to be focused on the triple tack here. And what we're looking for is for the needles to separate when we're rolling the throttle off. So basically we're simulating an engine failure or something like that. We're testing the sprag clutch, make sure that the rotor is freewheel. So the sprag clutch or the freewheeling unit, whatever you want to call it. We're just making sure that capability exists and it's modeled in the aircraft. So we'll talk about this in more depth. Actually, no, we'll just talk about it now since it's specific to the X-Trident 412. So the 412 has got a plug-in. Its very own plug-in. I think I mentioned that a little earlier, where basically you can assign the throttle function. So we've only got one twist grip on the ProFlight Trainer Puma. So we can assign it to throttle 1, we can assign it to throttle 2, and we can see right here, throttle 1 is the lighter colored twist grip, and throttle 2 is the darker colored twist grip. So I've got it set for both. And for normal operations, that's really what you would want to do. Now, if you're doing an engine start or doing a cold and dark start, you can use this to switch back and forth between the two. But I pretty much leave mine in both because I very rarely do cold dark starts in my flight sims. All right, so now you see how we got that set up. Get out of that menu, and we are going to do some needle split tests. So we're going to do the first one here on the ground. And again, we're going to keep an eye on the triple tack here. And we're going to roll the throttle off in 3, 2, 1. There it goes. And that's a nice clean needle split. Engines 1 and 2 went to idle almost immediately. And you can see the rotor RPM coasting down as the freewheel units are disengaged, or the sprag clutches get disengaged. So that's pretty good. We're going to roll the throttle back up. Let those through Mary. There we go. Rolling it back on nice and smooth. Alright, so on the ground flat pitch, we have a pretty nice clean needle split, so that looks pretty good. Alright, now the next test we're going to do, same thing, just like we did in the last video, we're going to do it from an IGE hover. So power's coming in. Now I expect the rotor RPM to decay a lot faster because there's a lot more drag on the rotor system at an IGE hover than there is flat pitch. But there still should be some needle split. It shouldn't be as drastic as when we were flat pitch, but we still should see one. So once again, looking at the triple tack, throttle's rolling to idle in 3, 2, 1. Okay, actually really didn't see much of a needle split there at all. Could be realistic, although I'm thinking maybe not. I'm not sure about that one, because again, I expect the rotor RPM to decay a lot faster than it would at flat pitch, but I still would expect just at least to see some split in the needles, because the N2 should decay even faster. Nah, I'm on the fence about that one. But next thing we're going to do, we're going to try rolling the throttle off from cruise. Basically, we're just going to set up for just a regular straight-in auto rotation, and we'll use runway, 35 left, give us plenty of room. Actually, we might go to 35 right. Yeah, we'll go to 35 right, because we're already up at the altitude I want. So basically we're going to do the same test, just now from somewhat cruise flight, and here I definitely expect to see a needle split. Because the aerodynamic forces should take over spinning the rotor system, provided I get the collective down soon enough, and the engine should roll to idle pretty quick. Alright, so here we go. In cruise flight, throttle's going to idle in 3, 2, 1. There we go. There's our needle split. Looking pretty good now. Our rotor RPM's a little low for my liking. A little bit aft cyclic and right pedal, clean that up. A little bit more right pedal here. Alright, so the RPM is... That would actually make me kind of nervous in a real helicopter, how low that RPM is sitting. But we do have a nice clean needle split with the engines 1 and 2 sitting at idle. Alright, I'm going to roll the throttle back on for power recovery. Come on, engines. Running out of altitude here. Here we go. Whew. Alright. So, we got a nice clean needle split on the ground. Needle split hovering auto. Trying to think back from the last time I actually rolled the throttle off at a hover. Because it's not something we regularly do in the aircraft I fly on a regular basis. So, not seeing the, I mean, again, we expect the rotor RPM to decay faster at a hover, especially at a hover because there's so much drag on the rotor system when you take the power away. So I'm not ready to call that entirely unrealistic, but I still expected to see at least a little bit of a split in the needles. So still kind of on the fence about that one. Alright, now you may notice that we are not at Pahute Mesa. As a matter of fact, we're not even in Nevada anymore. The reason I did it at the test in the UH1 at Pahute Mesa is because we're pretty much restricted in DCS, and that was the highest elevation I could find. So here, we changed locations for two reasons. One, the 412 has a little bit more power available to it than the old UH1 does. And two, because I could. So we're at Lake County in Colorado, and we're at a field elevation of 9,937 feet, I think. So we're pretty close to 10,000 feet in field elevation. So that's pretty high up. Temperature is still 20 degrees. I left the temperature the same, but what I did do, crunch the numbers from what I think, if I think I interpreted those charts correctly. So we're sitting at about 10,000 pounds, and from, if I interpreted the charts correctly, the max weight this aircraft should have for OGE power is 9,000, somewhere around 9,000 pounds-ish. So I increased that an extra 1,000 pounds to make sure that we were going to be power limited for these approaches. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the other test. And if you're following along on the guide here, we're doing power limited approaches, which hence the high density altitude. And at 20 degrees, we're probably not too great. We're not, well, I mean, yeah, who am I kidding? We're at 10,000 feet. This is going to be high DA, even at 20 degrees. It could be worse, but I think we'll get the results we're looking for. Well, I hope. And if not, we'll just crank up the temperature. All right. So we're going to take off from here, and again, as usual, the winds are set to calm, so we won't have those helping us. And as you can see here with my nose drawing off to the right, we're doing this with AP1 and AP2 off. Not my best takeoff, but we'll take it. And increasing our power, and we can look at our ITT, where that light is already on. I'm still not sure when that's supposed to come on, but we're just under our max continuous limit, so we are using a little bit more power. All right, coming around to the right. And at this high altitude, there is a chance that we're going to be N1 limited or NG limited. I believe they call it N1 here. So that's going to be our cold section, our compressors, RPM. And at certain altitudes, that compressor just actually it's more of a temperature altitude combination, density altitudes really. That the NG section or N1 section just can't compress any more air, so that's going to limit your power. So we may run into that. We'll see. Because we're already pretty high up on the NG, as we can see there. All right. So the first approach we're going to do is we're going to do a shallow approach, which should help us out a little bit as far as managing our power. So the idea here is to make sure we stay. We're going to try to stay out of that limit. ITT limit. We're going to try to keep that light off, and we're going to make sure we don't exceed our N1 limitations. So we're going to make our approach right back to that same helipad that we took off from. There it is. Looking pretty good. And we're just going to keep this approach nice and shallow, nice and slow. Airspeed's rolling back nicely. We're lined up. Looking at the ITT, we're sitting right about 700 degrees. Bringing a little bit more power. Maintain this approach angle that I'm looking for. Airspeed's rolling back really nicely. N1 is looking pretty good. It came down a little bit from takeoff, which it should. Everything's looking pretty good. This should be pretty easy. Okay, so as I get a little closer, get a little slower, we're starting to roll back below translational lift here. So we should see an increase in demand for power. Looking at my torque, we're about 25%. Torque's coming in, a little bit more power, but we should already be in ground effect here. And there we go. So not too bad. Be able to terminate just with hover power, which is a lot. about 35 degrees. Oops. There we go, trying to hover with my face smashed into the instrument panel again. Alright, so that was pretty good. Now we're going to try the same thing just with a steep approach and see what we get. We're going to pull a little bit more power. We'll probably see that light come on. There it is. And we're in our takeoff power. Well, we're actually not. We're still below our max continuous. That light is kind of bothering me because I'm not sure when it's supposed to come on. And the manual I have doesn't say anything about a light on the ITT. I imagine it's a limit indicator, but it doesn't really correspond with anything I found in the Bell 412 manual that I have. Perhaps it's described in a Gusta-built machine. They have a separate manual, but for the Bell 412 manual that I have, it's not described there in that gauge. So, admittedly, that's not the best measurement, that light, since I don't have access to documentation that describes its function. At least, real world documentation that describes its function. So, that's going to be not the best unit of measurement. But we will look at all the other indicators, and we're probably not going to be torque limited on this approach. So I'm not going to be focusing too much on that. What we are going to be limited on is ITT and N1, because we saw, as I terminated that last approach, N1 shot back up to the top of that green arc. Alright, we're going to maintain our altitude here because we want to make this a nice steep approach. Airspeed's rolling back, and that's okay because I'm intercepted the approach angle I want to use right about here, so I'm going to begin my approach. Now initially this is going to take a lot less power than that shallow approach I just did because we're accepting that descent, but where we might get in trouble is at the bottom when we try to arrest that descent, making sure we have the power to do so. Now the 412 seems to have a lot of power, and the pitfall that most developers for flight simulators fall into is overpowering their models. So we'll see if this aircraft falls into that, and I actually kind of think it did because I just arrested the descent completely, and looks like we have OGE power. There's a little bit of a descent in here. Yeah, I inadvertently brought the aircraft to a hover. So that pitfall I was talking about looks like, yeah, so unless I misinterpreted those charts, which is entirely possible, those are new charts for me, we should not have OGE capability, and looking at our ITT, we are well below our max continuous ITT, and now one thing we are close on is N1. We're pretty close on that. But again, winds are calm. We don't have any winds helping us. Our airspeed is essentially zero. Actually have a little bit of a climb in. I'm not sure this is the most realistic, to be honest with you. I think this may have fallen into the same pitfall that I was just describing, where the aircraft seemed to be overpowered, and I think we might run into that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we're just going to spiral down here and set the aircraft on the ground. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the temperature. So 20 degrees may not be putting enough stress on the airframe. Not airframe, but the on the drivetrain here. So we're going to increase the temperature about 10 degrees Celsius. We're going to go to 30 degrees and see what that gives us. And hopefully that'll take away our IGE power. Now granted, if that is realistic, that makes the 412 a hell of a machine, which it very well may be. Again, I'll tell you, full disclosure, I've never actually flown the 412. I'm just doing this based on my experience with twin-engine helicopters and the 412 manual and the performance charts. So hopefully I've interpreted those properly. If not, we will see. All right, so let's oops, Cyclic went all the way forward. We don't want that. Let's get the temperature up here. There we go. And temperature, let's go ahead and increase that to, so we're at 22 degrees. Let's go ahead and take it all the way up to 30. 31, that'll do. All right. So with a 10-degree increase in temperature, that should degrade the performance of the aircraft. We'll do a quick hover power check IGE. Already we can see N1 screaming towards the top of that green arc there. And it looks like if anything is going to limit us, it's going to be N1. Which typically you only get N1 limiting at cooler temperatures. So, oh, there we go. So that mystery light is on, and we are right there at the beginning of our TGT limit. All right, let's turn this into a takeoff here. So this might be what we're looking for, since we already in our TGT limit. So once again, 765 is our max continuous TGT. So above that, we're in a timed limit. I want to say it's a 5-minute limit. So we're in our takeoff power there. This should give us the results we're looking for. And once again, we're going to shoot our approach right back to that same helipad we just departed from. And we're going to try, we're going to do another shallow approach. Just to make sure. Actually, you know what? We're just going to go right for the steep approach. I'm going to go right for the steep approach. So I'm going to keep my climb in. And I'm going to keep this turn kind of tight because I made my downwind a little closer to the field than I wanted to. Which will help lead off some of this airspeed. That's a stupid bank angle for this altitude. Probably wouldn't have done that in real life, but here we go. Alright, so here we go, and this is a steep approach indeed. Probably too steep, but whatever, we're committed. We're not actually committed, I can go around, but I don't want to make this video an hour long again if I don't have to, for multiple approaches. Okay, so we started our approach. Power is looking good. N1 is still towards the top of the green. And there we go. Had to lean over to the side to make sure we're on track to land at our intended point of touchdown. ITT is looking pretty good, just over 700, and it's creeping up as I increase the power. Looking at that rate of descent, still coming down. Keeping an eye on that N1. Looking pretty good. Rate of descent's a little fast. We'll bring in a little bit of power, a little bit of aft-slack, just shallow that out a little bit. And we're coming in almost vertically, so this is, again, this is a little bit steeper than I intended, but whatever, we're going for it. Alright, looks... keep bringing in that power, and we're coming in almost vertically, which isn't really what I wanted, but again, we're looking okay. Alright, so we're approaching our TGT limit. There we go. Now we're probably actually above 765, just glancing at the ITT. N1 is at the very top of the green arc. But no rotor droop. No rotor droop, so that's interesting. Yeah, because N1 is maxed at the top of the green. And right now I'm just going to disregard the ITT limitation here, and we're just going to experiment with the what it's going to actually take to get that rotor RPM to droop in this model. So I'm pulling, we're at pretty much max torque. N1 is way past the green into the yellow. RPM is still solid in the green. TGT is way past the limit here, and rotor RPM still in the green. So that's interesting. That is interesting. You know what? I don't know what it's going to take to get that rotor RPM to droop. Well, let's see. Alright, we're just going to ignore everything and just keep pulling the collector till something happens. Okay, there we go. Alright, so now we got an RPM, we got an over torque indication. So it looks like it's torque based? Okay. Which, alright. Well, let's try that again. Let's try to see when that RPM really starts to go down. So bring it up, looking at over torque. Right, sure, I understand the over torque. Okay, and it's not torque based. RPM still in the middle of the green. Looking at N1, keeping pulling. Okay, so it looks like as soon as N1 reaches the top of that yellow arc in that red line is when the RPM starts to droop. And to get that high, we have to get we're actually past the start limit, it looks like, on ITT. We're just going to keep this power in just to see. And there's a good chance in real life these engines would have to be either rebuilt or just thrown in the trash. Alright, so yeah, ITT has to go to the start limit, and N1 has to go all the way to the red line to get a rotor RPM droop in this model. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. So if that is realistic, that means, ooh, what's going on here? That's a new sound. I'm not even sure what that was. Did I overspeed it? Huh. I must have oversped it. I'm sorry, I wasn't paying it. Let's do that again. I have not heard that. I've had this model for a couple of years, and I've never heard that sound. So we're going to try to recreate that, because that's going to lead right into section 1.2.4. See what that was. No? Maybe it's because I did it to the right? I'm not sure what that sound was. That's an interesting one. Well, I'll have to go back and look at the replay and figure out how I made that sound. I'll try it again. Oops. Well, crashing the helicopter is a good way to make a sound you've never heard before. Okay, I'll go back and look at the replay and see how I did that. Initial thoughts is that this model, may be overpowered as far as its performance in hot and high situations. Now, the lack of RPM droop doesn't necessarily mean it's overpowered. I'm just not sure the engine modeling is quite correct. Again, I'm saying I'm not sure. It could be. Again, I've never flown the 412, let alone flown the 412 at 10,000 feet. So there's a lot of mystery there that I'm sorry, I just don't have great answers to. But we did see what it takes to get a rotor RPM droop, and that's significantly more than most helicopters would need for the RPM to start to droop. So not really sure about the realism of that. Now, moving on to section 1.2.4, looking at the warnings and cautions indications. When we did that test to try and get that rotor RPM to droop, we did see a couple of warning lights here up in the upper part of the dash. The over torque indication come on once we exceeded the green arc. We did see the rotor RPM light come on, and and we got that mystery siren, which I'm sure you guys are flooding the comments with now with the answer to. Yeah, never heard that one before. Of course, I've never flown this model this aggressively at this altitude. So I know it happened when I was in that steep right-hand bank with some nav cyclic in. And welcome back to Henderson Executive. And we are back at 2,000 feet. We are back in a 9,000 pound aircraft, and winds are still calm. Alright, so we're going to do we already knew what kind of power we were working with our IGE hover power check. And so next thing we're going to do for our next section, as we start looking at the collective, is we're going to do a OGE hover power check. So looking at, so once again, just to remind ourselves, we're about 25% torque IGE. So we're just going to pull straight up to an OGE hover. Yep, this is plenty OGE. And we'll have a look at our power. And we level that VSI here to get us out of the climb. There we go. Alright, and we're looking at about 30%. So 5%. Once again, we find ourselves with a 5% increase in torque. Now, that's actually not once again. I think the DCS model was a little bit less than that. I think it was like 3%. So 5% difference. That may be accurate. Again, I don't have. I just don't have the data available to me right now. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just don't have it to say if that's accurate or not. I would expect a little bit more power to be used, but maybe that's just my expectations from the aircraft I normally fly. It's usually a bit more than that. I mean, I would expect at least, well, I guess 5 isn't unreasonable. I won't call it unreasonable, but I would still expect a little bit more power to be used OGE at 2,000 feet than what we're using now. So we'll call it realistic-ish. How's that? I know it's not the best answer, but without the data and without actually having flown the helicopter, I really can't give you guys a solid answer on that. I'm sorry. So let's talk about RPM reaction to the collective as we transition into forward flight here. So in an aircraft as modern as the 412, I don't expect to see a lot of RPM fluctuation with collective movements, especially a twin. I mean, sure, with huge, we're going to slow down here a little bit. Forgot how fast this thing is. We're already speeding past 110 knots. Like I said, I don't expect to see a lot of RPM fluctuation with collective movements, but we'll see what we get. Alright, so cruising around about 70 knots, which is pretty good. Come back down to my test flight area here to the south, or to the north rather, excuse me. To the south, excuse me. We're just going to yank up on the collective and see what happens. I'm looking for, oh, look at that, we did get a droop. Okay, cool. And it was pretty instantaneous droop there as well. I'm going to lower the collective and see if we can't get a rise out of it. A little bit of a rise. Bring the collective back up again. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And we also got a little bit of torque effect with the yaw on the nose, which is pretty good. All right. Didn't expect to see that much. But it does, and perhaps that's the way this aircraft is in real life. And I saw the over torque light there, but we're doing a test, so that's okay. let's see, I'm going to jerk the collective up and leave it up there and see how long it takes the governor to get the rotor RPM back in the center of the green, if it does anyway. So collective's coming up. That's pretty good. All right, so that's actually pretty realistic, without being too crazy. And perhaps that huge fluctuation I wasn't expecting was due to me over torquing the crap out of the engine. So that would actually make sense. Okay, so that's actually pretty good. That's what I would actually call that realistic. I'm actually pretty satisfied with that. All right, so that's actually pretty good. Next thing we're going to look at as we move on to section 1.3.3 is vertical climb rates. So this one's a little bit trickier, and we're going to have to do a little bit of math to get this one figured out. So I'm going to have to go back to the performance charts, crunch some numbers, and then we'll be back with the aircraft on the ground ready to do some a series of takeoffs to judge if the rate of climb is accurate. Now we're at the approach end of runway 35 left, and we're going to do a couple of takeoffs to test the vertical climb rate for section 1.3.3. And unlike the UH-1, where we just got a, hey, here's your max rate of climb airspeed, what the 412 manual gives you is they give you an airspeed and a power setting, and they say, hey, at this airspeed and power setting, your rate of climb should be this. So that actually makes it really simple for us. So we don't really have to do 2 or 3, 4 different takeoffs to verify that that max rate of climb is accurate. What we can do is bring in the prescribed climb power, go to that airspeed, and check to see if the rate of climb is correct. So crunch the numbers. Hopefully I interpreted it properly. So for this weight and this temperature at takeoff power, and for takeoff power we're looking into, and here's another thing that I noticed before we talk about this, looking at the torque gauge. So here it looks a little bit different than it does in the manual that I have for the Bell 412. So this must be an Augusta 412 thing. So my torque gauge in my manual looks different. Not much different, but slightly different than this torque gauge. So we'll have the engine torque on the right-hand side in the right arc. And most of the markings are pretty similar as far as where the green arc goes and where the yellow arc and red line start. On the left-hand side, where it says mast, in the Bell manual that says transmission. So now what that means is when the aircraft is in a dual engine configuration, meaning both engines are operating, you don't really have a torque limitation, you have a transmission limitation. So the engines together can produce more power than the transmission can handle, so the transmission is limited. Now we're going to go to single engine operation. You're torque limited. So the transmission can handle all the power from one engine, but that engine may damage itself if it gives too much power. So that gives you an engine limit. And there's actually more to it than that, but that's the long short of it. Okay, so we're going to do 2 takeoffs since they made it so simple for us. We're going to do 2 takeoffs. We're going to do 1 dual engine. We're going to do 1 single engine. So like I said, like I started to say, for these conditions, 20 degrees, and we're back at 20 degrees here, 9,000 pound aircraft, at 2,000 feet pressure altitude, we should see at 70 knots with max power, or with takeoff power, excuse me, we should see a rate of climb of about 2,200 feet per minute. Okay, and when they say max takeoff power, well, not max takeoff power, but takeoff power, we're looking at what in my manual is the yellow arc, but in this marking on the mast side is the light green arc. So that's going to be our takeoff power, and we're planning to go to right up to 90%, right in the middle of that green arc. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take off. We're going to assume a 70-knot attitude, and we are going to pull in about 90% on the mast or transmission side of the torque gauge, and look here at our vertical speed and see what kind of vertical speed we get. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Power's coming in. We're off the ground. Not the best takeoff, but whatever. Alright, keep pulling that power in. We're a little bit nose low for a 70 knot attitude. There we go. That's about 70 knots. Keep bringing that power in. Alright, there's our takeoff power that we have for 5 minutes. We're approaching... We're about at 70 knot attitude. And looking at the rate of climb, about 20... Oop, I let the nose climb there for a minute. Okay, that's right at 70 knots. Climb power is a little low. But yeah, it's settling. There's a little bit of fudge factor in there as I speed up. That's actually pretty close. I'll take that. Okay, not too bad. I sped up a little bit, about 10 knots, but the rate of climb was right in the neighborhood. So we were at 2,000 feet per minute. We can look at how much altitude we gained while I was trying to get that airspeed under control. So yeah, that's actually pretty accurate. So so that's good for the first takeoff. Now, in the second one, we're going to do is we're going to do it single engine. Now, the 412 is one of the few helicopters. Not few. There's probably more, but single engine hover power is. It's not as common as you might think in twin engine helicopters. But apparently the 412's got it, so we're going to test it. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to the approach end of runway 35 left. We're going to roll one engine back to idle, and we're going to roll number 2 back to idle. And we're going to do another takeoff and see how accurate that is. So once again, we're looking for a 70 knot attitude at takeoff power, and now this time we're going to be looking at the torque side of that gauge, and we're looking at our max continuous torque single engine is about 58% according to the Bell manual, and that actually happens to correspond with the top of the green arc on the torque side. Oop, I should look outside and fly the helicopter instead of poking my head in and looking at the torque gauge. Alright, let's get back over here to the approach end of runway 35 left. There we go. Okay. Alright. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back up, and we talked about this earlier. So we're going to go to the 412 plug-in, and this works for your Pro Flight Trainer. We're going to go to hardware throttle is, and we're going to say number 2 only for this test. Alright, we got that. We're going to look down, and now we should see when we roll the throttle off, only the number 2 throttle control is moving, and we see a needle split on our torque gauge and on our triple tack. So we can see engine number 2 spooling down to the idle position. Number 1 is still up in the green and looking good. Okay, so for this test, we at 70 knot attitude, at 58% torque, which is our max continuous single engine torque setting that we can have without damaging something, looking for a 400 foot per minute rate of climb. Not a lot, but we're also single engine, so that's one engine carrying the brunt of the load. Alright, so right away, let's give, and I hope I should be able to give them points for this later on, but as far as indications go for single engine, this is exactly what we should be looking at as far as the torque gauge and the triple tachometer. So points for that there, X-Trident. Alright, so let's go ahead and start this takeoff. I'm going to be a little bit more deliberate with my collective application since we're single engine, because we're already close to that 58%. So there we go, right there, right at the top of the green arc, and assume that 70 knot attitude. Rate of climb, it's actually hanging out right about 500 feet per minute. Approaching 70 knots, and it's dripping right back down. It's hovering close to the 400 foot per minute rate. There's our 70 knots. I'm going to bring the Cyclic back just a little bit, keeping that rate of climb in. Okay, so that needle's starting to settle. It's actually a little high. It's a little high. And I don't even have all that power in. So we're actually looking at 1,000 feet per minute. single engine, and I don't even have all the power in. So bring up that max power in. Yeah, that's I'm even fast. So if I slow down to 70 knots, we're going to see an initial spike in our rate of climb as we treat some of that kinetic energy for potential, but we're still averaging above or around the 1,000 foot per minute mark here. So that's telling me that this model is overpowered for single engine operations. We should only have seen about 400 feet per minute, unless I misinterpreted that chart, which is entirely possible, but it doesn't match what I came up with. Alright, so we're back on the ramp, and we're going to do another test here. Now we're going to start looking at the Cyclic and how it behaves with this model. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pick up and we're going to do one more hover power check, but we're not looking at the torque this time. We're looking at cyclic positioning here. So we're going to pick up to a hover. Once again with the AP1 and AP2 off. Alright, and cyclic positioning is it's not far from the center point here. So we're going to note that, looking down at the cyclic at its positioning, looking pretty good. Okay, so we're going to put the aircraft back on the ground. Eventually, because I'm hunting corks, I'm trying to make this a smooth touchdown. There we go. Alright. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and adjust the aircraft's center of gravity. And we're going to hit customize, weight and balance. Alright, center of gravity, we're going to shift that. And one thing about X-Plane that I don't really care for when I move it, there we go. I wish they would have the scale here instead of up here, but that's fine. So we're going to move our center of gravity forward. Not too much. Oh, yeah, that'll do. Because we want to see a good change here. So I'm going to apply those changes back in the aircraft. And hopefully it's not too far forward where we slide forward and hit that fuel truck there, because that would be catastrophic. Alright, so I'm going to start lifting up on the collective. And we can see that shift in CG has actually made us tail heavy. I misinterpreted what that meant, so I need forward cyclic. Oop. So now we're hovering nose high, which even now, this is kind of weird, but yeah, we're hovering nose high. So that is certainly interesting. And that's the first time I've ever messed with the CG and X-Plane, so that was a fun experiment for me, and now I know. So what we'll do is we'll put, just for fun, we're going to put the aircraft down. And we're going to, let's see here, where's my mouse? There it is. We're going to shift it again. And I think what we're doing here, we may be shifting it left and right instead of forward and backwards. And that's the thing about the CG and X-Plane. Can't really tell. Is that forward aft CG? Is that lateral CG? I don't know. I just don't. I hope it's in the manual, but we're going to shift it off to the left here, and we'll see what we get. and hopefully we don't get a collision with that fuel truck. Alright, so once again with the shifted CG, I'm going to bring in some power. Alright, so now we can see that we're nose heavy. So bringing some aft cyclic in, which was needed, and there's a fuel truck that we don't want to hit. Hello, Mr. Fuel Truck. That's a rather odd barking place for you. So with shifts and CG, there is some needed cyclic corrections that you need, so that's pretty accurate. Not too crazy about the implementation in X-Plane 11, but this is a Bell 412 review, not an X-Plane 11 review. But so as far as cyclic position goes, that's a pretty realistic reaction to shifts and changes in center of gravity. So we'll give them full points for that. Alright, so we're in the home stretch of this part of the review. The next thing we're going to look at is we're going to check and see if translational lift is modeled, and we're going to do that on our way to the slope area that I have scouted out, which happens to be right in front of us. And then we'll talk about the cyclic sensitivity, which is a good time to talk about that right after we do slopes. Right, so for translational lift, we're basically going to look for our as soon as our airspeed gets above 16 to 24 knots, we're looking at an increase in efficiency of the aircraft, particularly the we're looking for an increase in efficiency of the rotor system. So we're looking for, we'll probably experience a slight dip if it's modeled really well, followed by a increased rate of climb for the same power setting as we accelerate through 16 to 24 knots. So we'll bring the power in. There we go. Alright, I'm just going to leave hover power in here. I'm not going to make any more changes. I'm just going to treat this like a minimum power takeoff, or limited power takeoff. And as we accelerate, not seeing much of a dip here, but I am seeing an increased efficiency. So that'll do. It's not the greatest, but it is no doubt, as we're starting to climb here, no doubt that translational lift is here, it's present. I'm just not seeing all the physical signs of it. That's okay. Alright, next thing we're going to do is we're going to do some slope landings, and as you can see, the terrain mesh is a little different in X-Plane as it is for than it is from DCS. So the place I have in mind is right over here, and it's a 10-degree slope. It's right off the approach end of runway 35 left here, and 10 degrees just happens to be the max slope for the 412 according to the Bell manual. And it looks a little bit ferocious of a slope here, but I think that's because of the texturing, or the ortho photos here. Alright, so we're going to do a right skid high. Looking pretty good here. And again, we're looking for the amount of cyclic control that we need to do a successful slope. So we're going to come down nice and vertical. And forgive my hovering, but I don't have a lot of references here. Alright, so the uphill skid is on the ground. Applying a little bit of uphill skid as I lower the collective. Gently lower that downhill skid. There we go, it's on the ground. It didn't take me a whole lot of uphill cyclic, but it was enough. Actually, yeah, that was actually pretty good amounts as we centered the cyclic, put the collective down. And looking at our attitude indicator, we're just shy of 10 degrees. So that's about what we're, so that's just shy of the max slope limit for this aircraft, which doesn't really look like much, but there it is. Alright, so we'll pick the aircraft back up. I'm just going to bring a little bit of collective in and start applying cyclic into the slope uphill. Need a bit of left pedal, keep our nose straight. There we go. And bringing the aircraft straight up. A bit more control on the pedals there. Alright, that looks pretty good. Alright. Not bad. Not bad. I would have expected to use a little bit more cyclic into the slope, but then again, that might be enough for the 412. I don't know. Once again, I haven't actually flown this ship. And I don't think the fore and aft, the nose up slope limits are 10 degrees, but we're going to try it anyway. So we may exceed a limit here, but that's all right. It's a simulated helicopter. The damage will be pretty cheap to fix, if there is any. All right, coming down, looking to get the toes of the skids on. There we go. And lowering the collective a little bit and adding forward cyclic to gently lower the heels. There we go. Not too bad. And pretty decent amount of forward cyclic as I bring it to center. You can see that. Alright, bring the power back in. I'm going to lead in with some cyclic so we don't slide down the hill backwards, because that would be horrifying. There we go, raising the heels of the skids up and lifting off. There we go. Alright, so slopes are I would say that's pretty realistic. Now I'm not sure how realistic is me exceeding the fore and aft slope limitations, the nose up slope limitations, but as far as the cyclic input goes, that wasn't too bad at all. I'm inclined to give them the full point for that one. Now let's talk about the sensitivity of the cyclic here. So again, I can't say this enough. When it comes to flight sim helicopters, there's this, and I'm going to get on my my soapbox here for a second. There's this perception that hard to fly equals realistic, and if the cyclic isn't super duper sensitive, that helicopter must be unrealistic. Not true, guys. Not true. Some helicopters, especially larger ones, are particularly easy and relatively easy to fly as far as the cyclic goes. Now the 412, it's a bit more snappy in its response than the UH-1 is, from what I can tell, as far as simulated models go. But it's still as responsive as it should be, as I think it should be for a medium twin-engine helicopter. It's not gonna be swirly like an R-22 is. Larger helicopters are inherently more stable, so the amount of cyclic input that you would need to get the aircraft to do what you want, you're still talking about small corrections. And if you've watched anything I've done today, it doesn't really take much to get the aircraft to do what you want, and that's really what we're looking for. We're not looking for small movements to cause the aircraft to flip over, but you know, all these maneuvers we're doing really doesn't take much as far as cyclic displacement to do, with the exception of things like slopes or any high angle things. But you can see, looking at the cyclic here, hopefully that's in the shot here, it really doesn't take much to get the aircraft to do what you want, and that's what I look for when it comes to realism. How much cyclic does it take to get the aircraft to do what I want it to do? And that was really what my complaint was with the FSX models, is that it took way too much cyclic input to get the aircraft to make small movements. And with this model in X-Plane, you can see that the amount of cyclic required to get the desired motion is pretty small, which is pretty realistic for most helicopters, even the larger ones. So when it comes to larger helicopters, you should be making less corrections, especially at a hover, because the aircraft is inherently more stable. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You have a bigger rotor system, you've got heavier weight, which makes it less susceptible to atmospheric upsets like wind and things like that. but for the most part, the cyclic sensitivity, in my opinion, is right about where it should be for a medium twin. I'm pretty pleased with it. Okay, so specialty equipment, we won't go through all of it here because I don't want to make this a 2-hour video, but the X-Trident does come with some vertical reference equipment. And if we're looking at the plug-in, we can see, let's see where we're at here, load control panel. There we go. So it actually comes with its own bit of with its own external loads, which are pretty cool. So there's a GPU, there's a compressor, there's a Bobcat, and there's a bunch of things in here that you can use. A pallet, pipes, a giant Rubik's cube. That's actually pretty fun. It looks cool. I don't know who's actually running around slinging Rubik's cubes all over the place with a helicopter, but there you go. You can also choose your cable length here, which is pretty neat. It's in meters, not feet, for you American folks like me. Must be an Augusta thing. I don't know. And you can populate these things as you want, and that's actually pretty cool. Now the physics of it are not realistic, so be warned. And the ones in the plug-in. Now the native sling load physics of X-Plane are a little better. They're not perfect, but they are better than the plug-in. The plug-in sling load is it's I'm not going to say it's realistic, but it is kind of fun. One, because of the different loads that you can use, but you're not going to get a lot of pendulum effect. And a lot of techniques that you would normally use to stabilize an oscillating load aren't going to work. And you're not really going to get a lot of load oscillations with the 412 plug-in. So just keep that in mind. So there is VR stuff available. Now, that being said, you're still in a non-vertical reference configured ship here. So there's no bubble window here. I'm not even sure you can pop off the door or still lean out the window. I mean, I guess if you're flying VR, you can just stick your head out the window like I'm doing, but it's not really configured for vertical reference, and there's no mirrors or anything like that. But if you aren't flying VR, even if you are flying VR, you can switch to an external view and you can do that. It's not the most realistic experience for vertical reference flying because you're not actually doing the vertical reference part of it, but it's something you can do. Okay, some other stuff that this model has, you've got a hoist if you have it configured for that, and you got to read the manual for this to figure out how to add a hoist to your particular model. So you can, it'll be in the SAR control panel here. So you can, if you're operating and the hoist comes with the different libraries, or you can go into the model, the file itself, and add a hoist. And there's a couple of different types of hoists to choose from. In the manual, it'll teach you all about how to add equipment. And you can add other equipment too, not just a hoist. You can add the fast fin, tail fin modification, which is really cool. It doesn't really give you any added performance as far as I can tell, but aesthetically it looks great. You can add floats to the skids, high skids. The floats don't function as far as I know, but again, visually they look pretty cool. And you can add like door gunners and stuff like that. The door gunners don't shoot, I don't think. But again, there's a bunch of options for configuring the helicopter in X-Plane that are pretty neat. So all things to keep in mind. And so there are other things you can do to configure in special mission equipment. Its functionality. When it comes to functionality, one thing that is cool, and you can see here on the center panel, you have auxiliary tanks that you can add, which are functional. And you can see the control panel for that, and also a belly tank that you can use, and you can see the control panel for that there, and that actually works in X-Plane for fighting forest fire. So if you have the forest fire setting on, you can actually go and hover over any water source that's deep enough and fill up the belly tank and then go fight forest fires with it. So that's cool. So even for that alone, I would give them 4 points for that functioning belly tank, which you can't really get in any other sim without some special third-party programming. So it comes with the X-Trident model, and that forest fighting capability is organic to X-Plane, so that's pretty cool. Alright, so looking at the last bit here, at section 1.7.1, my personal opinion on this model, it's kind of hard for me to give you my real life experience with the 412 since I don't have any, but based on my experience with twin engine helicopters, it's actually not too bad. I like the twin engine modeling, with the exception of its overpowered single engine performance. Its OEI performance is pretty overpowered, and we saw that with the single engine climb out. And there were some other things I wasn't too crazy about, especially I think it might be overpowered in general, and we saw that when we were up in the mountains in Colorado. It's kind of hard to say without the data, but I'm kind of thinking we may have a little bit too much power model in this thing. That's really my only complaint about this. Like I said earlier in the video, I've had this model for a couple of years. It is my absolute #1 go-to choice for instrument training. So to supplement my real-world instrument training, this is the model I go to. Not only, and we've been flying with it off, but the AP1 and AP2, those are fantastic, especially if you're going to do more procedurally focused instrument training. If you're doing basic instruments, just attitude and airspeed and stuff like that, you can turn that off and just practice that. But I particularly like to do more procedural type instrument training, so I'll turn the AP1 and AP2 on, and I'll use the autopilot, which that's another, going back to section 1.6.2, the autopilot in this model works phenomenally. Now, there's a couple of hiccups, especially with the ProFlight trainer, with the collective. So when you're looking at, we'll get rid of the start panel. When you're looking at the plug-in joystick in safe mode, kind of helps. So basically, it's mostly in the descent. When you set your altitude, the altitude hold won't disengage until you lower the collective past the point where it was when you engaged it, and that can lead to some pretty crazy and interesting things when you're on an instrument approach. But the autopilot works phenomenally in this model, and that's one of the reasons it's my go-to ship for instrument training, especially if I'm doing a flight on Pilot Edge or something like that with live ATC. I can set the autopilot for the route that I want, and it's coupled to the GPS, so you can use that if you want. I typically keep it in nav and follow the VOR, so I can use the HSI here and tune the VORs the way I want, to the radial that I want, and basically let the autopilot do the flying, and I do the managing, which is really the hard part of instrument flying. After you get the BI down, of course, but so I can focus on talking on the radios, tuning the next nav aid, getting set up for the approaches. It's great for single pilot instrument training. That's one of the main reasons I bought this model, and it has not let me down for that purpose. So personal opinion, I wouldn't use it for sling load training. Of course, I wouldn't use any simulator, home-based simulator training for sling load training, but sling load entertainment, it's good for that. Instrument training, perfect for that. And its overall flight characteristics are pretty much what I would expect from a medium twin of this size and weight. So my personal opinion, we're probably looking at, the only thing that's really holding it back is its that overpowered single engine performance and possibly overpowered dual engine performance. So we're looking at about 4 out of those 5 points.